Hey there, welcome back to the channel. If you're someone who loves digging into those dark corners of history that most textbooks shy away from, those twisted royal secrets that feel too strange to be real, then you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're diving into a story so haunting, so deeply unsettling, that it was nearly erased from official records. It's about a king so desperate to hold onto power, so obsessed with purity that he broke every sacred law of love and blood. He married his own sister. And what followed wasn't just scandal, it was a legacy of suffering, madness, and an ancient curse that would bleed into generations of his descendants. So grab a blanket, settle in, and let's step into the candlelit halls of a palace where the walls remember everything. Even the sins they were built to hide. The kingdom of Altheria was one of the oldest monarchies in Eastern Europa, its roots tangled in ancient rituals, forgotten gods, and a royal bloodline that prided itself on divine purity. To be born into this blood was considered a blessing, but it came with a terrifying price: the expectation that this blood must remain untouched by outsiders. For centuries, the royal family of Altheria had encouraged marriage among cousins, nobles of appropriate lineage, and even spiritual unions blessed by temple seers who claimed to see a soul's worth in its purity. But no one, not even the most radical of priests, had ever dared to suggest what King Edric III would eventually do. Edric was born during a storm so violent, the cathedral windows shattered just as his mother went into labor. Midwives said they heard screaming from the castle walls, not from people, but from the stones themselves. The child was pale, with eyes so light they looked almost translucent in the candlelight. His mother, Queen Lyra, died within hours, her body covered in strange bruises no physician could explain. Some whispered it was a punishment for bearing a child with too much power in his veins. Others said the child had already begun to consume life around him. He grew up alone, despite being surrounded by servants, guards, and tutors. There was an eerie silence that followed Edric everywhere. Animals wouldn't come near him. Candles flickered low when he entered a room. His voice was soft, but his gaze pierced through people. Even as a child, he had a strange hold over the palace, an aura that made grown men bend to his will and made the most devout priests forget their prayers. But there was one person who never feared him: his younger sister, Evelini. She was born just 2 years after Edric, under what the seers described as a sky bleeding silver. Evelini was everything Edric wasn't: warm, charming, full of laughter. Where he brought shadows, she brought sunlight. The people loved her, and Edric adored her in a way that went far beyond brotherly affection. They were inseparable. Childhood games turned into long rides through the forest, where they'd vanish for hours with no guards, no escorts, just the two of them. When nobles whispered about their closeness, Queen Lyra's sister there and temporary regent dismissed the gossip as baseless. They are royal blood, she'd say. They share a soul, but others weren't so sure. Rumors began to swirl: unseen kisses in the garden, the way Edric looked at Evelini during court gatherings, the time they were found asleep in the same bed, fully clothed but too tightly entangled to explain away. When Edric turned 17, he was crowned king. No one cheered, the people stood still. The cathedral bells rang, but the sound echoed hollow. It wasn't just grief over their previous king's passing. It was fear, because Edric didn't smile. He didn't bow. He stood there, tall and still, and announced his first royal decree in a voice that seemed far older than his years. "No royal blood shall marry beyond our house," he said. "The divine must remain unspoiled." Many assumed he would choose a cousin, perhaps a noble woman from the house of Velar. But instead, he shocked the court with something even the darkest whispers hadn't predicted. He declared his intent to marry his sister. There was silence, then laughter from one drunken noble, then a scream from a priest who collapsed to the floor, blood dripping from his nose. Evelini stood frozen, her face unreadable, but she didn't protest. Not once. The High Council objected, they pleaded. They summoned historians, religious leaders, even neighboring monarchs to intervene. But Edric had already reshaped the law. In less than a week, the ancient scrolls were rewritten. The divine purity of the bloodline was now sanctified through sacred unification, a phrase he invented to mask the horror behind it. The wedding took place under a blood moon. Witnesses say the sky turned a deep, unnatural red that night. The palace halls were lined with mirrors, as per Edric's command, though no one could understand why. The guests hand-picked, silent, and pale-watched as Evelini walked down an aisle of black rose petals, wearing a gown stitched with bone-colored thread. She did not smile, her hands trembled. But again, she said nothing. And when Edric placed the crown upon her head, sealing their union, the windows of the great chapel cracked from the inside. Soon after the marriage, the royal court began to unravel. First came the deaths. The chiefster drowned in his own bathtub, though no water was found. The court musician's tongue turned black before falling out entirely. The royal physician disappeared, only to be found days later inside the palace well, folded in half like a broken puppet. The people began to whisper about the curse. They said it had awoken with the marriage, a punishment for violating nature itself, and yet Edric seemed untouched. He walked the halls unbothered, Evelini beside him like a ghost tethered to his soul. She began to waste away, her skin growing pale, her eyes dull. No pregnancies were ever announced, though many suspected. Otherwise, some said she lost children in secret. Others said she was barren, cursed by the gods for her sin. One winter, a servant named Ilya claimed to have seen Evelini sobbing in the garden at night, her dress soaked in blood. The next day, Ilya vanished. Her body was never found, but her shift was discovered near the dog kennels, ripped apart, covered in bite marks too large for any dog known to the palace. Behind closed doors, Evelini wrote letters, hundreds of them, to no one. They were never sent, just folded and hidden in the walls, under floorboards, inside books. One letter, found years later, read, "I dream of fire in my womb. Something is alive, but it is not a child. It has my face and his eyes." By Edric's 30th year, the palace was half empty. Servants fled, nobles requested reassignment to distant territories. The throne room echoed with silence, save for the ever-burning torches Edric insisted remain lit. Day and night, the few who remained swore the flames never dimmed, even when soaked with rainwater. Some nights, the light cast strange shadows, figures that didn't match any person present, and then came the child. No one saw the birth. No official record was kept, but one day, a cradle appeared in the royal nursery, and Edric announced the arrival of his heir, Prince Thalin. The infant had no hair, no lashes, no eyebrows. His skin was a sickly gray, and his eyes, when they eventually opened, were entirely black. Nurses refused to care for him. 2 of them leapt from the tower in the same week. A third went mad, ripping her own face apart before she could be restrained. The people had had enough. Whispers became wails. The curse had a name now, the curse of the incest king, and it was only beginning. Prince Thalin's birth was supposed to mark a new beginning for the kingdom of Altheria. At least, that was the official line spoken by trembling court scribes and trembling nobles who still feared Edric more than they feared the curse itself. But behind the stone walls of the palace, no one dared pretend that this child was a blessing. From the moment he came into the world, it was clear that something had gone horribly wrong. He did not cry, not once, not during birth, not during feeding, not when he was left alone for hours. The wet nurses claimed he never blinked. One said that when she tried to rock him in her arms, his tiny fingers latched onto her skin like claws and didn't let go until she screamed. Another nurse reported finding animal bones inside his cradle. No one knew how they got there. The palace had no pets. They were all slaughtered or driven away after Evelini began complaining that their eyes followed her, whispering in the dark. When Thalin turned 3, the palace cats began vanishing again. A guard, assigned to night watch near the nursery, swore he saw the toddler standing at the window at midnight, eyes glowing faintly, humming an old lullaby that hadn't been sung in the kingdom for over 2 centuries. That guard was found the next morning with his face frozen in a smile, so white it had torn the corners of his lips. The only thing carved into the wall above his body were the words, "The blood remembers, Avellini never held the child." Not once, in fact, she began to vanish from public view altogether. Some claimed she'd taken a vow of silence, others said she'd gone mad. But a handful of servants believed she had become something else, something trapped between a woman and a shadow. They said she was often seen walking the same hallway again and again, dragging her fingers across the wall, mouthing words no one could hear. One mate swore that Avellini walked through a locked door. Meanwhile, Edric's grip on reality and on the kingdom grew more twisted. He declared that all portraits of past rulers be burned and replaced with paintings of himself and Avellini, seated on twin thrones, hands intertwined. In one painting, Thalin was placed between them not as a child, but as a miniature adult, his body dressed in royal armor far too big for his small frame. Artists were forced to repaint his face repeatedly because Edric kept insisting they weren't capturing the darkness in his eyes. One painter went blind after finishing the final version. He claimed something in the canvas had been watching him. Edric also changed the royal seal. Once a golden lion, it now became a serpent eating its own tail, an ancient, forbidden symbol from the pre-religious days of Altheria, one that scholars believed had been banned for centuries. He began wearing black robes, refused sunlight, and stopped eating anything but raw meat and honey. Priests who visited him left shaken, unable to describe what they saw. One wrote in his diary before disappearing, "He is no longer a man. He is the echo of something ancient, and we have built him a throne." Outside the palace, the kingdom was rotting, crops failed without explanation. Livestock were born deformed or refused to feed their young. A strange sickness spread through the capital. People's teeth fell out one by one, and their skin turned pale, almost translucent, before they collapsed in the streets. Priests called it the White Hollow, but no cure ever worked. Entire villages were abandoned, fields became cemeteries, but Edric didn't seem to care. In fact, he ordered that the bodies of the dead not be buried. Instead, they were to be laid in glass coffins and arranged in neat rows outside the palace gates. "Let them see the cost of disobedience," he said. No one knew who he meant by them. The curse had grown bolder now. It no longer hid in shadows. It was alive in the soil, in the wind, in the lullabies mothers no longer dared sing. Thalin, now 6, was kept mostly in the western wing of the palace, which had been sealed off to everyone except a handful of silent caretakers. Visitors describe hearing strange sounds from that wing, flute music, laughter, and once, a voice calling out in perfect imitation of someone who had died years earlier. When a young court jester was sent to entertain the prince, he never returned. All they found was his hat, soaked in ink, sitting in a chair facing a mirror that had never reflected anything since the day of Thalin's birth. Avellini, growing more spectral by the day, began to write again. Her letters, hidden behind tapestries and under loose stones, revealed a woman unraveling. One note read, "He says the child is not his, but ours. He says we belong to the same breath. But I do not breathe anymore." Another said simply, "I hear the crying now. It's not his, it's mine." And it never stops. On the 7th year of Edric's rule, Avellini vanished. No body was found. No farewell, no announcement. Just a cold draft in her chamber and a single crown left on her pillow split clean in half. Edric said nothing. He hosted a banquet the next night, with her seat left empty, but a goblet filled to the brim with red wine that no one dared touch. Halfway through the feast, Edric raised his cup and whispered, "She's only sleeping." Then he drank it all, staining his mouth crimson. Thalin's behavior became more erratic. He began speaking in dead languages. He etched symbols into the walls using his fingernails. He asked for books that hadn't been seen since the Dark Ages. When a priest was brought in to exorcise what they believed was a possession, he barely made it an hour inside the room before throwing himself off the palace balcony. Witnesses said his eyes had turned entirely white. In desperation, the High Council attempted a coup. They gathered in secret, forged a plan to remove Edric from the throne and exile Thalon to a distant monastery. But the night before their plan was set to unfold, every member of the council was found inside the great hall seated upright, dressed in fine robes, their mouths sewn shut with golden thread. Not a drop of blood had been spilled. It was as if they had volunteered. Edric announced their deaths as the council's final gift. From that day, he ruled alone, no advisors, no council, no queen. Just a boy who whispered to shadows and a throne room that smelled faintly of salt and sulfur. The people began to leave the capital in waves. Those who remained claimed they heard music coming from the palace at night, even when no one lived there anymore. Some swore the torches still burned, though the oil had long run dry. Farmers found strange footprints in their fields 3 toed deep, as if left by something heavy with a hunger that never slept. Years passed. Edric never aged. His hair remained dark, his skin unwrinkled. Thalon grew taller but never truly looked like a child. His eyes remained black, his smile crooked. Birds refused to fly over the palace. Rain never touched its roof. It became a place frozen in time, haunted by the legacy of one choice: a brother marrying his sister, believing he could preserve purity, only to birth something far darker. The curse, by then, was no longer whispered. It had a name etched in blood and memory, the line of ash, and its story was far from over. By the time the outside world began to forget the once glorious kingdom of Eltheria, the palace itself had become a living monument to despair. Overgrown ivy strangled its spires, statues crumbled from the inside out, faces eroded not by weather, but by something colder, something deliberate. Travelers avoided the region entirely, claiming that compasses spun wildly near its borders and horses refused to move forward when the winds changed. They called it the Hollow Crown, a place where time buckled, memory decayed, and nothing natural dared to grow. And yet, inside those walls, the curse endured. Thalon, now a young man by appearance, moved through the palace like a dream that couldn't end. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was never the same twice. Sometimes high and childlike, other times deep, like the toll of a funeral bell. Those who encountered him reported that he looked through them rather than at them. A maid, one of the last remaining in service, claimed he asked her what it felt like to be mortal. She fled the kingdom the next day, leaving behind nothing but a single word scrawled on her mirror in ash: empty. There were no servants left, no advisors, no guards, and still Edric sat on the throne as if nothing had changed. He no longer held court. He spoke to no one, but every morning, without fail, he walked into the grand hall, placed his crown on his head, and sat in silence. It became a ritual. The same black robes, the same goblet of wine, now thick and nearly black. Whispers spread beyond the kingdoms. Abandoned borders, carried by merchants and fugitives. They said the king drank blood, that he had outlived 3 generations, that he was no longer a man, but something sustained by guilt, power, and a bond so unnatural the earth itself could not absorb it. Then came the plague, not like the previous ones. No fever, no rash, no signs. People simply stopped. Their hearts froze mid-beat. Their eyes clouded with gray mist. Entire villages became frozen dioramas of death, as if time itself had gasped and refused to move forward. The lands closest to the palace were hit hardest. The curse was expanding, stretching its fingers across the map, and no force could hold it back. A small group of monks from the northern mountains, those who had preserved the forbidden texts and rituals from long ago, believed they had found an explanation: the cycle of binding. According to ancient legend, a soul entwined through a natural union did not create life, but a loop, a repeating pattern of suffering. And with each generation born from such a union, the loop deepened, corrupting the bloodline and the world around it. But there was more. The scrolls described something called the splintered one, a being born not fully of this world, nor the next. A child of mirror and marrow, a prince who would carry the memory of every ancestor, but none of their humanity. A being who would one day shatter the loop, not by breaking it, but by becoming its final vessel. The monks believed Thalin was that vessel. Back inside the palace, things were shifting. Servants who dared enter the throne room found the mirrors those strange, ancient fixtures Edric had ordered hung decades ago had begun to ripple like water. Reflections didn't match reality. Some saw a Velini standing behind them, though she had been gone for years. Others claimed their own reflections grinned when they were weeping, or whispered secrets from a mouth that never moved. One night, desperate for answers, entered the throne room with a blade drawn and demanded Edric abdicate the throne. Edric never moved. He simply stared, and then the knight's armor began to rust and rot on his body. Within seconds, the man collapsed, bones brittle as dust. His sword melted before it hit the floor. Thalin, now fully grown in form, began appearing in the eastern villages though the roads had long been sealed. Witnesses swore he passed through walls, that he walked barefoot, leaving trails of frost behind him, that he sang lullabies in voices that belonged to their dead loved ones. Children stopped speaking after seeing him. Some scratched symbols into the walls, matching the same carvings found centuries earlier in forgotten tombs of the royal line. One woman, an old herbalist who claimed to be descended from a bastard branch of the royal family, had visions of Thalin in her sleep. She described a dream where she stood in a forest of mirrors, each reflecting not herself, but versions of Edric and of Velini young, old, decayed, beautiful, monstrous. And in the center stood Thalin, skin as pale as moonlight, holding a crown of thorns in one hand and a mirror with no reflection in the other. He spoke only one sentence: the blood forgets, but the walls remember. The dream ended with her waking up blind inside the palace. The walls had begun to bleed. Thin trails of dark liquid oozed from the cracks in the stone, winding like veins across the floor. Torches would light themselves. Doors creaked open when no one was near. And in the grand library, all the books had been rewritten, same covers, same titles, but every page inside now bore only one word, repeated endlessly: return. Scholars who examined the palace in secret during what they called the Moonless Pilgrimage claimed the architecture had shifted. Hallways that once led to bedchambers now opened into endless black corridors. A staircase in the west tower led nowhere for over an hour of descent before finally opening into the same room they had started from. One member of the group went mad, tearing out his eyes and screaming, "He sees through us all." Edric, unchanged in body, began speaking again, but only to Thalin. Servants who overheard their conversations claimed he spoke in riddles and old tongues. Once they heard him whisper, "When the mirror breaks, we break with it. You are my." Ending, Thalin never responded. He only watched. Then, one night, something happened that shook even the cursed walls. The mirrors shattered, every mirror in the palace, all at once. A thunderous crash that echoed for miles. Shards rained down like rain, the sky turned black in broad daylight. And at the center of the throne room stood Thalin, his hands dripping, with blood not his own, staring at his reflection in a pool of wine spilled from Edric's goblet. That was the last time anyone saw the king alive. The next day, the palace was silent, the throne was empty. But Thalin remained, and he had begun. To smile. Ask ChatGPT. No one saw Edric's body, no grand funeral, no royal proclamation, no tomb in the crypts beneath the palace. The man who had rewritten the laws of nature, who had bent bloodlines into loops and carved a curse into the very marrow of his kingdom, vanished, just like that, as if he had never existed at all. And yet, in every corridor of that palace, his presence lingered. A scent that never faded, a chill that clung to the bones. A shadow that refused to stay still. Thalin sat alone on the throne. Now, his eyes, blacker than the void, stared ahead unblinking. He didn't speak. He didn't move, but those who dared enter claimed they could hear whispers when standing near him, faint, fragmented, and always in the voices of those they had lost. Sometimes he would blink slowly and smile, as if amused by secrets only he could hear. His skin never wrinkled, his heartbeat was never heard. It was as if the body on the throne was only a shell, and something older had crawled inside. In the first year of Thalin's silent reign, the rivers dried, not from drought but from something darker. The water turned thick, tar-like, and anything that touched it withered. Crops died mid-bloom, animals gave birth to lifeless, twisted things. Storms raged across the outer provinces, lightning striking the same tree again and again for hours. But inside the palace grounds, there was stillness. The air did not move. No leaves rustled. Time seemed afraid to pass. The people, what few remained, began calling the capital the City of Echoes. Not because it was loud, but because everything their repeated movements, sounds, even emotions. A man who wept near the gates would hear his own sobs echo back days later. A woman who screamed in grief would find her voice bouncing between windows even after she had fallen silent. It was as if the city itself had become a mirror, reflecting pain endlessly, feeding on the memories of those who hadn't yet fled. And still Thalin did not speak. The monks from the northern mountains returned, older now, fewer in number, carrying relics and pages from the ancient texts they had hidden for generations. They believed Thalin had become the final echo, the embodiment of the curse, the last note in a song that had begun the day Edric and Evelini defied nature. He was not a man, they said, but a vessel of memory, of sin, of legacy. And he could not be destroyed, not by sword, not by fire, not even by prayer. They tried anyway. One monk, an elder named Rilvan, fasted for 40 days, bathed in sacred ash, and entered the palace alone. He carried only a book and a candle. Witnesses said he disappeared behind the gate. Hours later, the sky turned red. Not like fire, but like raw flesh. Clouds bled, rain fell upward. And from the palace windows, people swore they saw hundreds of faces pressing against the glass, faces long dead, faces they remembered from their childhoods, faces that wept but made no sound. Rilvan's body was never found, but the candle he carried reappeared in his monastery days later, still lit. After that, no one dared approach the palace again. Years passed, or perhaps centuries. Time became meaningless near the City of Echoes. Seasons stopped shifting. Children born near the borderlines came into the world with pale eyes and mouths that never cried. Trees grew in circles, shadows fell in the wrong direction. Maps could no longer mark the land correctly. Every time a cartographer tried to draw it, the ink would twist and the land would blur, as if the kingdom was folding in on itself. And at the center of it all, Val and Dot still on the throne, still watching. One man, a wandering historian named Kess, attempted to document the fall of Altheria. He traveled far and wide, collecting fragments of tales, lost letters, even carvings made by survivors who had escaped the inner zones. He stitched them together into a single manuscript for 100 pages of madness and myth. When he presented it to the university council in a neighboring realm, they laughed, called it fantasy, until the lights flickered and every page burst into flame. The fire did not spread, it consumed only the manuscript and Kess himself, who smiled even as he turned to ash, whispering the same words over and over. He is waiting, he's always waiting. The curse was never lifted because it was never a curse, not in the way people understood it. It wasn't a punishment sent by gods, or a spell cast by vengeful spirits. It was a chain reaction, a biological rot passed through generations, born of a single unnatural choice. When Edric took Eveline's hand and placed a ring upon it, he didn't just defy law, he tore a hole in reality itself. Love, twisted into obsession, blood, bound into a loop. And from that loop, a consciousness was born, a child of memory and silence, a being that could not die because it was never truly alive. Thalin was that being. The final result of a bloodline that devoured itself, and perhaps he still sits there, beneath the weight of a crown no man should wear. Maybe he still listens to the echoes of 1,000 sins bouncing between stone halls. Maybe when you look into a mirror and catch a flicker of movement behind you that isn't really there, it's not your imagination. Maybe the curse reaches further than you think. Because mirrors remember. And so does he.